Good evening, everybody, or hello, good day, depending where on the globe you are all sitting. I'd like to take the opportunity before we begin with the music to thank David Pöppel and Dana Bevilacqua for helping me through an enormous amount of technological problems that we needed to solve in order to set this home studio up. Obviously, I've never done anything like this, and thanks to the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt, I received all the equipment, and with patience, I was helped through this very complex process of getting this to work. Now, we hope that the technology will continue as reliable as it has been. We're going to be talking about Beethoven's Piano Sonata Opus 101. It is commonly referred to as the first work of the so-called late period. While the division of Beethoven's work into three periods is slightly schematic and therefore problematic, nevertheless, it's useful because it gives us sort of a sense that Beethoven starts something new with the sonata, and indeed he does. There is a sort of a whole of creative output for about 2 years, 1812 to 1814, where Beethoven does very little composing. He is stuck in legal battles for the custody of his nephew, Karl. His deafness is worsening. And for that reason, he's not putting too much music to paper. Also, the heroic style that he was so fond of and used to for so many years, that culminated in the Fifth Symphony, Seventh Symphony, is now also coming to a halt in the sense that he doesn't really believe in it anymore. It is no longer ringing true with the status of the world. Now, what is the status of the world? 1814 is the Vienna Congress, begins the Vienna Congress, where the laws of Austria are rewritten. Napoleon has been defeated. The powers of Europe gather in Vienna for several months to celebrate the defeat, to celebrate peace after the years of war. And Beethoven becomes quite aware of what is happening around him because he's also commissioned by the Vienna Congress to write heroic works celebrating Germany, celebrating the victors. Now, this is a very strange situation for Beethoven. On the one hand, he is becoming more and more popular as a composer, but not for the pieces he wants to be popular for, but because of these rather populist works. But he is so popular that he almost becomes like a star. His opera Fidelio that had bombed the first time around is now taken up again and performed about 30 times. So Beethoven is a made man. When people meet him in the streets, they applaud him. And all the while, he is stuck compositionally. He feels this triumphant style is not working. It's not true. Why? Because the Vienna Congress, of course, is reversing all the innovations, the social innovations that Napoleon had brought to Europe, despite them being brought to Europe through wars, incredible wars. So there's an ambivalence in society. On the one hand, you have people applauding the defeat of Napoleon because finally there's peace, but at the same time lamenting the fact that the virtues of the French Revolution have been done with as well. So Beethoven starts sketching out the sonata in 1814, and what we see is that he sketches out a kind of a first movement and the last movement as a unit. And the last movement, as you will see when we get into the details of the work, is extremely polyphonic and made up largely of a fugue. And the first movement is sort of an introductory, I wouldn't call it improvisational, but it is sort of a preludierend, as they said in those years. It's a kind of improvisation. I'll play you a Bach Prelude, just so that you get a sense of what Beethoven might have been thinking of. And now listen to Beethoven. So very similar character. The key of the prelude is E major. We're, of course, in a sonata in A major, and I will discuss the relevance of this in just a moment. But what's interesting is that there is this turn back to the Baroque. This is old musical style. In those days, in Beethoven's youth, one didn't really go back to old styles to compose music. One played the past music, the music of dead composers. But in fact, there is a funny anecdote. Beethoven's teacher in Bonn, Daniel Gottlob Neefe, in order to make a little bit of extra money on the side, he went to concerts and wrote reviews. And there is a review of a concert, and I'm paraphrasing what Neefe wrote. Last night in the Palais such and such, there was an interesting experiment. There was a concert with music of only dead composers. This obviously is a novelty, and we've never done this before, and we hope it won't become a tradition. So there you go. Beethoven knew the Well-Tempered Clavier as a boy. He played it, and he knew some other works by Johann Sebastian Bach, but not too many. And in fact, the revisiting of this Baroque music is what launches a new style in Beethoven. It propels him forward with new creative energy. And he receives from his publisher copies of sonatas by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and by Händel. And mind you, for Beethoven, Händel was the greater composer than Bach. So this is an interesting turn in Beethoven's consciousness. He's looking back at music history in order to be inspired to do something new. And when he finally finishes the work, he sends it to his publisher, and as he often comments on daily occurrences, he's commenting on a recently published review of his own symphony in A major, which had been reviewed as difficult to execute. One can only imagine how difficult it was to get together an orchestra in Vienna and to perform a new work. Our ears are used to almost perfection in performances, certainly not in Beethoven's time. So Beethoven is upset that his A major sonata is referred to as A major symphony is referred to as a symphony that is difficult to execute. So he says to his publisher, you may actually call this sonata a sonata difficult in execution in A major. One might think that difficult is a relative term, for what seems difficult to one person will seem easy to another, and thus the term says nothing at all. But viewed in a different light, it must be conceded that the term says everything. For whatever is difficult is also beautiful, good, great, etc. Hence, anyone can see that this is the most lavish praise that can possibly be bestowed. For what is difficult makes one sweat. So not only is the sonata new in its approach to the integration of Baroque music, but also in extreme difficulty, technical difficulty, difficulty for the listener. He's just forced to make sense of what he is being presented. So let us dig into the piece a little bit more in detail now. And what I'm going to show you are elements of the work that I find to be interesting. Obviously, this sonata has been performed now for over 200 years, and there are many different takes on the work. I can only obviously give you my own, but these are the things that I find to be extremely interesting. So we had opened with a sonata. That's a key that we're introduced to, but in fact, A major, the sonata, is in this key. We don't hear the tonic, the so-called tonic. We only hear the dominant. And when it could come, the tonic, we are taken elsewhere. Again. Beethoven is avoiding A major. Still not there. The first third of the movement is almost finished, and we still haven't heard the tonic. So what's happening? This is the strategy of the sonata. In fact, if you think of the early sketches, first movement, prelude, and fugue, it makes sense, sort of a dominant tension that will be released into the final movement of kind of a fugue in A major. Now, I want to show you a couple of things that are quite interesting. If we go here into the score, I'm going to mark where I just stopped off, right here. And now listen. So this line, if you didn't see it as you can see it on the score, would think that's just a pulse. But in fact, the changes of chords are hovering over the real meter, which you don't hear, but I'll sort of accent the pedal. So this hovering over the meter gives the whole movement a kind of a suspended sense, a sense of floating. It is a short sonata form movement in 3 parts, and when we finally get to the so-called recapitulation, which is the 3rd page, which you can see here easily, we actually finally get to that long-awaited A major, the key the sonata is written in. So let me play you. Now we're in A major. And now firmly established on A major. But of course, that would be too easy. And if you take a look at the very ending, what Beethoven does here, there's a cadence in A major. So that's, in tonal music, the way you clarify a key. Just write a cadence and everybody knows that's closure. But if you look at the score, that very cadence is slightly off. Again, it's hovering over the actual meter. So if you play the measures before, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So again, instability. It's not quite finished yet. And that's part of the entire strategy. So let's hear again. And now he extends the delay of the tonic. And yet again. So delaying the tonic is the whole point of this movement. And the next movement takes that key, that pitch, and alternates it. Changes it into the third of F major. And a few other things I'd like to point out about this first movement. It's intimate, yeah? It is called A Little Lively with the Most Intimate Feeling. And the writing, the texture, is really unpianistic, as is much of this sonata. But here, specifically, it almost, if I go back to the score, you can tell here, you can see how it's four voices. You have like a first violin, you have a second violin, and you have the viola and the cello down here. So a string quartet. Now, unusual to write string writing for a pianist, huh? And the whole point is this is intimate music. It is private music. With the Vienna Congress, not only is peace now in Vienna, but also spies. They flock to the concerts of the Vienna Congress. And this worsens, of course, over the years under Metternich. Finally, in the worst part of Metternich, Vienna, every 10th citizen is a spy for the state. So a police state. And retrieving into the home after the Napoleonic Wars, of course, but also where one could speak freely, is a reality, a political reality. You were not allowed to gather Schubert certainly experienced this more heavily than Beethoven. You're not allowed to gather more than two people on the streets because you could be arrested for that. So the repressive state is outside. Liberty, freedom is perhaps only in the home, inside, in the interior. And sure enough, that change into the public domain. So this march we have as a second movement is very shocking. But because of that connection between A major and F major, they share the same key. There is a connection. And to speak of it philosophically, it's a dialectical relationship. It's a Hegelian relationship. Opposites are one and the same for Hegel. There is the private and the public, the subjective and the objective. And clearly the march is as objective music you can imagine. What is it designed to do, a march? A march is designed to create a collective feeling, to create a collective cause and galvanize the masses to one unified goal. Now listen to the march here. A very odd march that has elements in it that really don't belong into a march, such as the sighing motive. This is yearning. And we even hear that a bit later. So we have all these sighing motives. I'll point them out to you. So you have, the first one I played is here, then we have them a little later here. And in fact, the whole Baroque character, I mean, this is polyphonic music. It's a polyphonic march. It's a contradictio in adjecto. I mean, how do you argue that a march that should unify should have actually individual subjective individual voices? So it's a defamiliarized march, if you will. Long before Brecht introduces the alienation effect into theater, or the defamiliarization process, we see Beethoven doing actually that, taking something that is commonly associated with collectivity, with unified harmony, and making it a different gesture through the polyphony. So these are all musical motifs that don't really belong into a march. And what's more, the climax is not a triumphant this, but leads into the lowest, darkest register of the piano. And this extraordinary section, I'll play it slowly so you can hear the harmonies. Extraordinary. These post-Wagnerian harmonies, basically, all as a result of counterpoint, of moving counterpoint. But Beethoven doesn't shy away from clashing dissonances. In fact, he seeks them. It's almost akin to what Ives, 100 years later, would write to his publisher when he sends him the Concord Sonata, and he says, all the wrong notes are right. So this is very similar. The clashing dissonances are what Beethoven is after. And that final climax down here is the lowest note of the piano. And it sort of introduces the notion that the music that we were used to in marches was through night to light, the Enlightenment figure, metaphor, now turns into through light to night. Its turnaround. Perhaps as a commentary to what has happened to the ideals of the French Revolution after Napoleon has been defeated. And Beethoven wouldn't be Beethoven wouldn't he actually show us a utopian counterworld. At that very moment, when we have arrived at the lowest, darkest point of the movement, a few measures later, right here, Beethoven turns the page. And my pedal here is not broken. It's supposed to be sustaining this way. So almost a childlike, beautiful, innocent episode that is blurry. And the blurriness, this so-called pedal effect that Beethoven uses here, he uses almost in every piano work. Famously, the second movement of the third piano concerto. So it's a dream world, a counter world to the reality. That's how I think Beethoven uses this these pedaling episodes. And it's certainly very fitting in the March of Opus 101, because once we've arrived now we have emptiness And now the transition back to the march. And back to the polyphonic imitation. So, with this clashing dissonance at the very top. He doesn't shy away from it. But so if you want to explain a little bit of what that is, the objective reality of the march, if you will, the lowest F, the nadir of that movement, is juxtaposed to the subjective quality. It's the subjective within the objective. Hegelian yet again. And what's more, we actually see something quite stunning. I'm showing this right here. If I play the right hand alone, what does it remind you of? Of course. It's a reminiscence of the first movement. Again, the subjective within the objective. You barely hear it. It's sort of hidden away, huh? But for the reader or the player at home, clearly audible and visible. This is yet another aspect, by the way, that I might just mention briefly. Piano sonatas in those days were not performed in public. They weren't performed in concerts the way we're used to today. Nobody in their right mind played a piano recital. Once in a while, if Beethoven had an academy that he had organized, he would improvise at the piano as one little piece in the program of an orchestral program. But to perform a piano sonata was not the tradition. And in fact, during Beethoven's lifetime, only 2 sonatas were performed. This particular one, oddly enough, one of the most difficult ones he wrote, and Opus 90. So 2 late sonatas. And what's more, not only were they performed, one of them was performed in Vienna and the other one in Boston, Massachusetts during Beethoven's lifetime. So we're sort of doing something similar. I'm performing in Berlin, and some of you may be listening in the United States. The march, of course, has, as it would, a trio, a counter idea. And let me play this for you. You may be able to detect it right away. Of course, it's a canon. Again, a polyphonic structure. It doesn't belong to a march. And what's more, the use of these rigid contrapuntal forms enables Beethoven to be freer than he ever has been before. And even when you play it, it's almost as if the rigid form of the music, of the compositional method, is giving license to play freely, as if in a contrapuntal improvisation. Let me play you from the double bar. So it's a free fantasia in canonic style, if you will. And this then leads back to the march. The next movement of the sonata is written langsam und sehnsuchtsvoll, slowly and yearning. What's more, it's written for a particular sonority that Beethoven asks for here, sul una corda, with one string only. And for those who are not familiar with the piano, the mechanism that this does is that the keyboard and the hammers in the piano move slightly to the right when I depress the una corda pedal, And thus, the hammers don't hit all strings. You know, in the middle register in the Steinway, you have 3 strings per key. Well, now the hammer will only be striking 2 strings, which dampens the sound somewhat, brings it back. It's not to be confused with the moderator pedal, which Schubert uses, which doesn't even exist anymore on modern instruments, which is a real felt damper that goes onto the strings and completely changes the sonority of the piano. This is not what Beethoven is asking for, but it is suggestive of a extremely removed sound, introverted sound, as if the pianist is playing only for himself. And the improvisational character is extended as if Beethoven is sort of inventing the progression of chords. And once he's arrived, he picks up a new musical idea. And now, as if reminiscing of the 2-part invention of the trio, he imitates that as well with a little flourish. Now we hear just 2 voices. Now, all key instruments can't change the tone once it's been hit, except for the clavichord. And we know that the clavichord is the most private instrument composers used. It was Bach's favorite instrument. On the clavichord, you can strike a key and then vibrate on it. It's sort of a marriage between a string instrument and a keyboard instrument. This almost suggests that one would want to be able to do a slight vibrato on the top note here. Yeah. So extremely intimate, extremely sparse. There's no luxurious harmony. I could, of course, play it that way. I could play This is what one generally would call beautiful piano sound. That's not what Beethoven is after. And if you take a look at the score, there's something very strange. He writes pedal only here and here and here. Everything else the score suggests should be played without pedal. Now, if I do that, it's going to sound slightly jarring. Let me show you. Now pedal. Now no pedal. Again, no pedal. So strange. And to tell you the truth, to this day, I'm not 100% sure what Beethoven is after here. In any case, to me it seems filling the sparseness of sound with unwritten pedaling is not the solution. Because then it wouldn't make sense that Beethoven writes a pedal marking. So be that as it may, we finally approach a stronger sonority on the very top of the page. So we have now the sonority builds. And leads to an improvisation. And we're back to the first movement. Now that makes sense. That's where he writes nach und nach mehrere Seiten. Poco a poco tutte le corde. So he wants the normal piano sound to come back. And at the very moment when the normal piano sound is back, we are transported back to the beginning of the sonata. One can't talk about late Beethoven without at least quoting Theodor Adorno once. Adorno refers to this section as the first time in music history where memory plays a role. I think he has a point. This is the sense of looking back. Not only looking back in style, but also within the sonata, going back to the first movement, revisiting that opening measure, and now leading it elsewhere. And now again, we have that dominant feeling. We're gonna, Beethoven is tricking us. And now we have the dominant. Finally, we've arrived in A major. We've waited 3 movements long for this moment to arrive. Now that is a recipe. It's that triumphant through night to light. But now, of course, juxtaposing the gesture with musical material that is not enlightenment, or very little enlightenment. In a sense, this is, again, Baroque music. If I play you the Prelude E major from Book 2 of the Well-Tempered Clavier of Bach. The similar imitational style. And sure enough, that's that final movement that Beethoven sketched out together with the Prelude. This is the Baroque polyphonic movement that is a full-fledged sonata form. It's the most complex movement of the entire sonata, and it has many elements, and I want to pick out some. Take a look, for instance, at this here. From here. So we have it's almost like a rocking motion. So swaying back and forth, cradling, if you will. To my mind, this music of this last movement has a lot of childlike qualities. We also have reminiscences of the heroic style, but in distance. Yeah, we have a large fanfare, but I tricked you. That's not how Beethoven wrote that fanfare. You see it up here? It's in pedal marking again, distant, imagined. So it's the memory of the military fanfare. Listen to the whole episode. And then Beethoven interrupts it, as he's commonly known for. There is a famous anecdote that apparently he was improvising for some aristocratic donors, and people were moved to tears when Beethoven finished, and he got up, slammed the keyboard lid, and said, "You fools." So this is what we hear. Don't get too moved. Yeah? And then we also have elements that are very simple, if not to say childlike. So the closing figure is as simplistic as can be, something that Beethoven would have not really readily used in his middle period. So listen to that ending. Then we have a transition to the development section with that simplistic motif. I tricked you again. That's not what Beethoven wrote. Aha. And now we're in a new chapter of the book, so to speak. And sure enough, this is where the fugue begins, and it is one of the most radical compositions I know of Beethoven. And so on. You heard the sudden bursting of sound, suddenly coming into the foreground through the forte. Three entrances of the theme are in pianissimo. And then suddenly everything opens up. It's sort of a similar approach to the ending of the third movement, where everything is subdued and then suddenly it opens up. Now, like the march, this sonata makes a point of using dissonant notes as marked peaks. But what is the most stunning, I think, in this sonata is that we have a culmination at the end right here on the lowest note. Remember I had said that note of the march is the lowest note on Beethoven's piano. Well, I was wrong. Actually, there's a lower note yet, this E. But that was so unusual, it was so new, that Beethoven asks his publisher to write out the names of the pitches. This is a transcription from his letter. So he wants each chord to be written out with name, not just notes. And this is from the manuscript. You can see it here at the very bottom where he has it. To get back to this theme, now, it's not only a culmination, a new nadir that we didn't even know existed, but we have hidden inside this octave the fugue theme. So the climax is a clashing dissonance at the lowest register, and we also, Beethoven takes no prisoners. He gives us open fifths and fourths. To make sure this is really a catastrophic end to the fugue. And then once he's established this lowest note, he takes it on he opens up the entire keyboard as it's never been opened up before. So this is one of the most stunning moments in Beethoven's oeuvre, that he uses a new technology and comes up with a musical idea that can only be done with this technology. As we approach the ending, this is then a sonata form, traditional form. Now we have the recapitulation, which establishes a tonic. And then we get to the finale, the coda. And this coda introduces sort of a lyrical aspect. I'll play you a little bit of it so you can hear it. So a sort of suspension of the drama. And so forth. I'm not going to play the ending because you should be, you should get it only at the end of the performance. But what you should hear now is the use of that lowest E that we heard as the catastrophic nadir of the fugue. So down here, we have it. It's a humorous version of that former catastrophe. It's the ironic break. It is now taking a different perspective, looking at that lowest key from a different perspective, in a different light, in a humorous light. And to quote Adorno once more, he refers to this section as a metaphysical bagpipe. So if you will, listen to it that way. And then we're at the end. So we're also at the end of the lecture part, and now I will perform the whole sonata for you.
Thank you.